On the 25th of March, 1944, General Dwight D. Eisenhower sat alone in his trailer at Supreme Allied Headquarters in London and did something that no American officer in his position had ever done. He wrote a resignation letter. Not a draft, not an outline, a letter addressed to the combined Chiefs of Staff, the Joint American and British Supreme Military Command, informing them that the Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force was requesting relief from his command, effective immediately, if a decision was not made in his favor by the end of the day. The decision in question was whether the Allied Air Forces, the most powerful concentration of military aircraft ever assembled, would be redirected from bombing German cities to bombing the railway network of occupied France in the weeks before the Normandy invasion. Eisenhower believed this was not a tactical preference. He believed it was the difference between success and catastrophe on the beaches of Normandy. Without destroying the French railway system, German armored divisions would reach the beaches within hours of the landing. The invasion would be thrown back into the sea. 156,000 men would die or be captured, and the largest military operation in human history would end as the largest military defeat in American history. Winston Churchill was against it. Churchill was against it because the British estimated that the bombing would kill between 80,000 and 160,000 French civilians. He was against it because he believed the political damage to the Anglo-French relationship, already strained by the Royal Navy's attack on the French fleet in North Africa 4 years earlier, would be irreparable. He was against it because Arthur Harris, the commander of the Royal Air Force Bomber Command, was against it, and because the American Air Force General Carl Spaatz was against it, and because Eisenhower was asking him to overrule two of the most powerful air commanders in the Allied order of battle. On the judgment of a man who had been Supreme Commander for exactly 11 weeks, Eisenhower wrote the letter. Then he put it in a drawer and walked into the conference room to fight for D-Day. Before we go any further with this story, if someone in your family served in the Normandy invasion, in the Allied Air Forces over France, in any part of the campaign that this decision shaped, drop their name and their unit in the comments right now. We read every single one, and subscribe if you have not already, so you are here for what comes next. Because the transportation plan was only the first time Eisenhower had to fight to save D-Day from the man who was supposed to be his most important ally. To understand why Winston Churchill was so resistant to the operation that was supposed to end the war in Europe, you have to understand what the English Channel had meant to him for 30 years. In February of 1915, Winston Churchill was First Lord of the Admiralty, the civilian head of the Royal Navy, and he had an idea. The idea was to attack the Ottoman Empire through the Dardanelles Strait in what is now Turkey, forcing open a passage to Constantinople, knocking the Ottomans out of the war, and opening a supply route to Russia. The naval attack would be followed by an amphibious landing on the Gallipoli Peninsula. The combined operation would be a masterstroke that would break the deadlock of the Western Front without requiring another 100,000 British soldiers to die in the mud of France. The operation was a disaster. The naval attack failed on the 18th of March 1915 when 3 British and French battleships hit Ottoman mines and sank in the strait. The amphibious landings at Gallipoli on the 25th of April were met by Ottoman defenders, who had been given time to fortify their positions by the naval attack's failure to achieve surprise. The Allied forces fought for 8 months in conditions of extreme heat, disease, and artillery bombardment, advancing in some places by less than a mile over the course of half a year. They withdrew in January of 1916, having accomplished nothing. Allied casualties were 250,000 men. Churchill was removed from his position at the Admiralty within months of the landing. He carried Gallipoli for the rest of his life. The specific wound it had left in him, the knowledge that he had proposed an amphibious operation and that thousands of men had died in it, shaped every strategic judgment he made in the Second World War with the force of a trauma that never fully healed. When Churchill looked at the English Channel in the years after Germany occupied France in 1940, what he saw was the Dardanelles Strait, another narrow body of water, another defended shore, another operation that sounded decisive on a map and could become catastrophic on the ground. He had been the man who had proposed Gallipoli. He was not going to be the man who had proposed the new Gallipoli. His strategic alternative was what he called the soft underbelly, attacking Germany and its allies through the Mediterranean, through North Africa, through Sicily, through Italy, through the Balkans, gradually wearing down German strength on multiple peripheral fronts, while avoiding the direct cross-channel assault that he believed would produce unacceptable casualties. When the Americans insisted on what they called a second front, a direct cross-channel invasion of France, Churchill found reasons to delay it. In 1942, the reasons were genuine. The American army was too new, too untrained. The landing craft did not exist. A premature invasion would fail. In 1943, the reasons were geographic. It was better to fight in North Africa, then Sicily, then Italy, than to attempt the Channel crossing until the German army had been significantly weakened. By 1944, Churchill had run out of reasons. At the Tehran Conference in November and December of 1943, Stalin had demanded a cross-channel invasion with a specific date and a specific commander. Roosevelt had agreed. Churchill had been outvoted, outmaneuvered, and left with no diplomatic means of continued opposition. He had written to Stalin in January of 1944 that everything was going full blast for Overlord. But as late as April of 1944, he was telling American officers privately that if he were planning Overlord, he would not execute it until the Allies had retaken Norway, invaded the Aegean Islands, and secured Turkey's support. He told one advisor in April that this battle has been forced upon us by the Russians and the United States military authorities. These were the words of a man who had publicly committed to an operation he privately believed was going to be the new Gallipoli. Dwight David Eisenhower was 53 years old when Franklin Roosevelt told him on the 7th of December, 1943, that he was going to command Overlord. Roosevelt said it in a characteristically casual way. "Well, Ike, you are going to command Overlord." And Eisenhower later recalled that the announcement landed on him with the weight of something he had been preparing for without being permitted to expect. He had spent his entire career being told he was good at his job in ways that had never previously produced the job that mattered. He was born on the 14th of October, 1890, in Denison, Texas, the third of 7 sons in a family that had very little money and very strong opinions about the importance of hard work and education. His mother was a pacifist who belonged to a religious sect called the River Brethren and opposed the military on principled grounds. When her son was accepted to West Point in 1910, she went to her room and wept. He went to West Point anyway. He graduated in 1915. The class the stars fell on, as it would come to be known, because more members of the class of 1915 would go on to become generals than any other West Point class in history. He was assigned to infantry. He trained soldiers throughout the First World War and never got overseas. He was still in the United States when the armistice was signed in November of 1918. This failure to see combat was something that followed him through the interwar years, a gap in his record that officers who had served in France did not have and that he could not fill. He compensated by being exceptionally good at everything else. He was a gifted staff officer with an unusual ability to synthesize complex information and communicate decisions clearly. He studied under General Fox Connor in Panama, whom he later described as the ablest man he ever knew, and Connor spent 3 years educating him in military history and strategy with a thoroughness that West Point had not provided. He attended the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth and graduated first in a class of 275 officers. He attended the Army War College. He served under Douglas MacArthur in the Philippines for 5 years, absorbing the operational complexities of managing a military force in a complex alliance while living under the difficult personal dynamic of working for one of the most demanding officers in the American Army. By December of 1941, when Pearl Harbor changed everything, Eisenhower was 51 years old and had never commanded more than a battalion in a field exercise. He was born on the 14th of October, 1890, in Denison, Texas, the third of 7 sons in a family that had very little money and very strong opinions about the importance of hard work and education. His mother was a pacifist who belonged to a religious sect called the River Brethren. She opposed the military on principled grounds. When her son was accepted to West Point in 1910, she went to her room and wept. She never fully reconciled herself to what he had chosen. He went to West Point anyway. He graduated in 1915. The class the stars fell on, as it would come to be known, because more members of the class of 1915 would go on to become generals than any other class in the Academy's history. He was assigned to infantry. He trained soldiers throughout the First World War and never got overseas. He was still in the United States when the armistice was signed in November of 1918. This failure to see combat in what was then called the Great War was something that followed him through the interwar years, a gap in his record that officers who had served in France did not have and that he could not fill. He compensated by being exceptionally good at everything else. He was a gifted staff officer with an unusual ability to synthesize complex information and communicate decisions clearly. He wrote papers and reports that circulated at the highest levels of the Army. He studied under General Fox Connor in Panama, whom he later described as the ablest man I ever knew. and Connor spent 3 years educating him in military history and strategy with a thoroughness that West Point had not provided. He attended the Command and General Staff College at Leavenworth and graduated first in his class of 275 officers. He attended the Army War College. He served under Douglas MacArthur in the Philippines for 5 years, absorbing the operational and political complexities of managing a military force in a complex alliance with a foreign government while living under the difficult personal dynamic of working for one of the most demanding and self-centered officers in the American Army. By December of 1941, when Pearl Harbor changed everything, Eisenhower was 51 years old and had never commanded more than a battalion in a field exercise. He had spent the interwar years writing papers, attending staff colleges, serving under Douglas MacArthur in the Philippines, impressing the officers around him in ways that always led to another staff assignment rather than a field command. He was 50 years old before he had commanded more than a battalion. He was 51 before Pearl Harbor made the accelerated promotion of capable officers into the kind of assignment that his abilities had always suggested he should have. By December of 1943, he had commanded the invasion of North Africa, the invasion of Sicily, and the invasion of mainland Italy. He had managed the coalition of American, British, and French forces that those operations required with a political skill that no American officer of his generation possessed to the same degree. He was not the most aggressive battlefield commander the Allies had. Patton was that. He was not the most meticulous operational planner. Montgomery was that. What he was, and what Roosevelt understood he was the man who could hold a coalition of competing national interests, competing military personalities, and competing strategic visions together long enough for them to accomplish something that none of them could accomplish alone. He arrived in London in January of 1944 and began working immediately on the most complex military operation in history. He had 7 months. The transportation plan was the idea of his deputy, Air Marshal Arthur Tedder, and a railway analyst named Solly Zuckerman. The concept was elegant in its strategic logic. The German army defending the Normandy coast was not in Normandy. It was throughout France and the Low Countries and Germany itself, positioned to be moved by rail to wherever the Allied landing occurred. If the railway network that connected those forces to the beaches could be destroyed before the landing, the marshalling yards, the bridges, the repair facilities, the junctions, the German response would be slowed from hours to days. The panzer divisions that could reach the beaches in 3 hours would instead take 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks, the Allied forces would have time to build the beachhead that the invasion required to survive. The plan required the Allied heavy bombers, the 800-plane fleets that had been pounding German cities and industrial facilities, to be diverted from Germany to France. This was where the opposition began. Arthur Harris, commander of Royal Air Force Bomber Command, believed that the war would be won by continuing to destroy German industrial capacity and German civilian morale through sustained area bombing of German cities. He had been making this argument for 3 years, and he had not changed it. Diverting his bombers to French railway yards, in his assessment, was a waste of the weapon he had spent 3 years building. Carl Spaatz, commanding the United States Strategic Air Forces, believed that the key to air superiority over the beaches on D-Day was the continued destruction of German aircraft production facilities and synthetic fuel plants. His plan, called Operation Point Blank, was already measurably reducing German air strength. Pulling his bombers away from Germany to bomb French railways was, in his judgment, exactly the wrong decision at exactly the wrong moment. And then there was Churchill. Churchill's objection was not about air strategy. It was about French civilians. The estimates being circulated in March and April of 1944 put potential French civilian casualties from the railway bombing campaign at between 80,000 and 160,000 people. The railway yards targeted by the plan were in the centers of French cities. The bombing technology of 1944 was not precise. Bombs missed their targets. They missed by hundreds of yards. In a city center, a bomb that misses a railway marshalling yard by 200 yards kills the people in the apartment. Buildings along the line. Churchill brought the matter to the War Cabinet on the 3rd of May, 1944. He said he felt some doubts as to the wisdom of this policy. He wrote to the head of the Royal Air Force, "You are piling up an awful load of hatred." He asked Eisenhower to set a limit of 100 estimated dead per raid. Eisenhower declined. The opposition extended beyond Harris and Spaatz. The British War Cabinet met to discuss the plan on the 3rd of April 1944, and Air Chief Marshal Sir Charles Portal told the assembled ministers that between 20,000 and 40,000 French civilians might be killed. Churchill told his colleagues he felt some doubts as to the wisdom of this policy. He wrote to Portal, "You are piling up an awful load of hatred." The calculation Churchill was making was not purely about casualties. He was also calculating what the French would think. The Anglo-French relationship had been strained since July of 1940, when the Royal Navy had attacked the French fleet at Mers el-Kebir in North Africa to prevent it falling into German hands, killing nearly 1,300 French sailors in the process. The relationship had been further strained by the complicated politics of Charles de Gaulle and the Free French movement, which Churchill had supported with varying enthusiasm and considerable frustration. The last thing the Anglo-French relationship needed, in Churchill's view, was for the liberation of France to begin with the Royal Air Force killing tens of thousands of French civilians in their own cities. He told Eisenhower directly, in a letter, and in person, that he wanted a limit placed on each individual raid, a cap of roughly 100 estimated civilian deaths per operation, above which the raid would not be authorized. The logic was that a series of smaller strikes, each individually below the threshold of political crisis, would achieve the same strategic effect without producing the concentrated civilian casualties that would make newspaper headlines and parliamentary debates. He told Eisenhower directly, in writing, on the 22nd of April, "We must never forget that one of the fundamental factors leading to the decision for undertaking Overlord was the conviction that our overpowering Air Force would make feasible an operation which might otherwise be considered extremely hazardous, if not foolhardy." The word foolhardy was not accidental. Eisenhower was telling Churchill that without the transportation plan, Overlord was foolhardy. He was using Churchill's own word for the cross-channel. Invasion back at him, Churchill appealed to Roosevelt. He sent the American president a detailed case for restricting the bombing, asking him to overrule his supreme commander. Roosevelt's response came quickly and without equivocation. Roosevelt told Churchill that however regrettable the attendant loss of civilian lives, he would not constrain his commanders from doing whatever it took for Operation Overlord to succeed. On the 25th of March, the day Eisenhower wrote the resignation letter and put it in a drawer, the meeting where he intended to force the decision took place. His private notes from the preceding Wednesday described his thinking. He had grimly thought through the idea that if he did not get the decision he wanted, he was going to take drastic action and inform the combined chiefs of staff that unless the matter was settled at once, he would request relief from this command.
He did not give Churchill an ultimatum directly in the room. He was too politically skilled for that. He gave the ultimatum to the people he knew would carry it back to Churchill, people like Tedder, like Bedell Smith, who knew the Prime Minister well enough to communicate with appropriate clarity that Eisenhower was at the absolute end of his patience and that the next conversation on this subject was going to be a very different kind of conversation than the previous ones had been. Churchill received the message. By early April, Churchill and Harris had both come around. The transportation plan was approved and set in motion. On the 27th of April, American heavy bombers flew from bases in England and struck their first targets in the French railway network. By the 5th of June, the day before D-Day, Allied aircraft had flown more than 20,000 sorties against French transportation targets. The railway system connecting Normandy to the rest of occupied Europe was systematically destroyed. The actual French civilian casualties were significantly lower than the estimates had projected. The final count was approximately 13,000. Terrible, and far fewer than either the 80,000 that had been predicted or the 160,000 that had been feared. French railway workers, organized through the resistance, had cooperated with Allied intelligence to ensure that the most dangerous missions were warned in advance where possible. The French general commanding Free French forces in Britain, Major General Pierre Koenig, had said of the plan, "This is war, meaning one should expect people to be killed." He added, "We would accept twice that amount if it would rid us of the Germans." But the transportation plan was not the only time Eisenhower had to fight to protect D-Day from Churchill. Subscribe right now before we go further. This is the story of the Supreme Commander and the Prime Minister, and the argument that nearly happened 4 days before the largest invasion in history. A new story every week, the decisions history glossed over, given the weight they deserve. It was the 31st of May, 1944, 6 days before D-Day. The greatest military operation in history was on the verge of being launched, and Winston Churchill informed his staff that he intended to be on board one of the ships when it happened. Not watching from shore, not observing from an aircraft. On board a Royal Navy warship in the English Channel, as 156,000 men crossed from England to Normandy under fire. Churchill's reasoning was not irrational. He was 69 years old and had spent 69 years of his life oriented toward exactly this kind of moment. He had served as a cavalry officer and seen action on 3 continents before he was 30. He had been First Lord of the Admiralty in both World Wars. He had been present, in various capacities, at some of the most dangerous moments of the war. He viewed his own physical safety as a significantly lower priority than being present at the decisive events of the conflict he was leading. He also believed and this was important, that his presence on a ship in the English Channel on the 6th of June would be good for the morale of the men crossing it. He had arranged, without formally requesting permission from anyone in a chain of command, to board HMS Belfast, one of the cruisers assigned to bombard the German defenses above the Normandy beaches. As Prime Minister, technically the head of His Majesty's government, he was not subject to the orders of the Supreme Allied Commander. Eisenhower could not tell Churchill what to do. He could advise, he could request, he could express with increasing firmness his view that the Prime Minister's presence aboard a Royal Navy warship under fire on D-Day was something that should not happen. What he could not do was give an order. Churchill had found a legal mechanism to make his presence aboard ship unassailable. As a ship of the Royal Navy, HMS Belfast was sovereign British territory. As Prime Minister, Churchill was entitled to be on sovereign British territory without requiring the King's permission to leave the country. He had constructed a bureaucratic argument for why no one could stop him from being in the middle of the D-Day invasion, and he had presented it with the specific satisfaction of a man who has found the loophole and knows the other side has no answer to it. The man who found the answer was King George VI. The king learned of Churchill's plans and did something unexpected. He announced that if the Prime Minister was going to be on a ship in the English Channel on D-Day, the king was going too. He wrote Churchill a letter on the 31st of May, a handwritten letter, delivered personally by his private secretary, Alan Lascelles, to the door of No. 10 Downing Street. The letter asked Churchill, in all seriousness, to reconsider his plan. The king pointed out that he was a younger man than Churchill. He was a sailor, and as king, he was the head of all three services. There was nothing, he wrote, he would like better than to go to sea. But he had agreed to stay at home. He asked, "Is it fair that you should then do exactly what I should have liked to do myself?" Churchill read the letter and remained undeterred. He acknowledged the king's concerns and continued with his arrangements. The king wrote a second letter on the 2nd of June, 4 days before D-Day. In it, he sharpened the argument. He noted that the presence of both the king and the prime minister aboard ships in the English Channel on D-Day, where they would be exposed to mines, to torpedoes, to German shore batteries, to everything the German military could direct at a fleet crossing the Channel, would have a paralyzing effect on the operation itself. The captain of the ship, the admiral commanding the fleet, every officer in the chain of command would be acutely aware that the survival of the British government's two most important figures depended on decisions being made in his area of responsibility. That awareness would not make the invasion go better. Churchill finally relented on the 2nd of June, with a visible and documented reluctance that his staff described as something between defeat and fury. He was not persuaded that the king was right. He was persuaded that he had no argument left to make. He eventually made it to Normandy on the 12th of June, 6 days after D-Day, aboard the destroyer HMS Kelvin. The bridgehead was secure by then, though still contested. Montgomery met him on the beach. Churchill made sure the Kelvin fired its guns at German positions while he was on the bridge. He got what he had come for, just 6 days late, and with the beachhead no longer in genuine danger. The transportation plan and the attempt to board HMS Belfast were not the last time Eisenhower and Churchill went to war with each other over the direction of the campaign. The deepest and most consequential argument between them came in the summer of 1944, over a question that historians have been arguing about ever since. The question was, Operation Anvil, later renamed Operation Dragoon, The planned invasion of southern France, agreed at the Tehran Conference in November of 1943 as a companion operation to Overlord that would land American and French forces on the Mediterranean coast of France near Marseille and Toulon, drawing German forces away from Normandy and opening additional port capacity for the supply of Allied forces in France. Churchill, by the summer of 1944, desperately wanted to cancel it. His alternative was to redirect the forces assigned to Anvil, an American and French army of nearly 300,000 men, with the landing craft and naval support to put them ashore, northward through Italy, and then east through the Ljubljana Gap into Austria and the Balkans. Churchill had been advocating for this kind of Eastern Mediterranean approach since the beginning of the war. In 1944, with the Soviet Union advancing rapidly westward from the east, the argument had an additional dimension that Churchill made explicitly. If Allied forces reached Vienna and the Danube basin before the Red Army, the political settlement of post-war Europe would be fundamentally different from what it would be if the Soviets arrived there first. He was not wrong about this. The post-war history of Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia would have been different, possibly very different, if Western Allied forces had reached them before the Soviet advance. Churchill was seeing clearly, a year before Yalta and 2 years before the Iron Curtain speech, that the geography of the liberation was going to determine the geography of the post-war order. Eisenhower rejected the argument anyway. He rejected it for the same reasons he had rejected every previous Churchill strategic alternative to the direct approach. The same reasons Marshall and Roosevelt had been rejecting Churchill's peripheral strategy since 1942. The war in France was not yet won. The beachhead in Normandy was secure, but the breakout had not yet happened. The supply situation for the Allied forces in France was already critical. Additional port capacity, Marseille and Toulon, was not a luxury in the supply calculations for the campaign in France. It was necessary. Without those ports, Eisenhower's forces would face a logistics crisis by the autumn of 1944 that would slow the advance to a pace that gave Germany time to recover. Churchill made the argument in every forum available to him. He sent Roosevelt telegram after telegram. He argued before the combined chiefs of staff. He proposed alternatives: a landing near Saint-Nazaire on the Atlantic coast of France, amphibious operations in the Aegean, a drive through the Ljubljana Gap in Yugoslavia that would bring Allied forces to Vienna before the Red Army. He framed it in geopolitical terms that were genuinely prescient. He was correctly predicting that whichever power liberated a given territory would effectively control its post-war political orientation, and that the Soviet Union was going to dominate Eastern Europe if Western Allied forces did not get there first. Roosevelt was not persuaded. The combined chiefs of staff were not persuaded, and Eisenhower was not persuaded, though he was the one who had to sit in a room with Churchill and say so. Churchill made the argument in every forum available to him. He sent Roosevelt telegram after telegram through June and July. He argued before the combined chiefs of staff. He proposed alternatives: a landing near Saint-Nazaire on the Atlantic coast of France, amphibious operations in the Aegean, a drive through the Ljubljana Gap in Yugoslavia that would bring Allied forces to Vienna before the Red Army. He framed the argument in geopolitical terms that were genuinely prescient. He was correctly predicting that whichever power liberated a given territory would effectively control its post-war political orientation, and that the Soviet Union was going to dominate Eastern Europe if Western Allied forces did not get there first. The argument he was making in the summer of 1944 was the same argument that would appear in his Iron Curtain speech 18 months later. Roosevelt was not persuaded. The combined chiefs of staff were not persuaded, and Eisenhower was not persuaded, though he was the one who had to sit in a room with Churchill and say so to his face. He met Churchill at Portsmouth in July of 1944 to make his case. A witness later described the meeting. Churchill had arrived stirred, upset, and even despondent. He accused the Americans of being a big, strong, and dominating partner. He made his argument for the Balkans approach with the full force of his rhetorical capability, which was the greatest persuasive instrument in the English language at the time. Eisenhower said no. He continued to say no all afternoon. He ended the meeting saying no in every form of the English language at his command. Churchill appealed to Roosevelt. Roosevelt sided with Eisenhower. The invasion of southern France proceeded as planned on the 15th of August, 1944, landing Allied forces on the Mediterranean coast against light and disorganized German resistance. The American 7th Army and the French 1st Army drove north up the Rhone Valley, linked up with Patton's 3rd Army sweeping east from Normandy by mid-September, and added the full strength of General Jacob Devers's 6th Army group to the Allied line in France. Marseille and Toulon were taken within 2 weeks of the landing, providing the additional port capacity that Eisenhower's supply calculations had required. Churchill later claimed he had been dragooned into supporting the operation and insisted on the name change from Anvil to Dragoon specifically to mark his protest. The name stuck. The honest verdict on the 3 confrontations between Eisenhower and Churchill in the months surrounding D-Day requires being fair to both men. Churchill was not simply obstructing. His concerns about the transportation plan's civilian casualties were genuine and morally serious. The estimate of 80,000 to 160,000 French civilian deaths was not a political argument. It was a calculation about human lives, and Churchill's resistance to accepting it as a necessary cost of the invasion reflected a moral seriousness about the use of military force that the record shows was authentic. He was wrong about the estimates, as it turned out. The actual casualty figures were significantly lower than projected, but his concern was not wrong.
His desire to board HMS Belfast was something else. It reflected the specific psychology of a man who had spent his entire career pursuing personal involvement in great events, and who was being told, in the most consequential moment of the war he had been fighting for 5 years, to sit at home and wait for news, like everyone else. There was something in Churchill that found this genuinely intolerable. His resistance was real, and his eventual capitulation came at personal cost that those around him could see clearly.
His opposition to Operation Anvil was his most consequential argument, and it is the one that historians have never fully resolved. The post-war history of Eastern Europe, the Soviet domination of the countries that the Yalta Agreements had assigned to Soviet influence, was shaped partly by the geography of liberation. If Churchill's Balkans strategy had been adopted, the map of the Cold War would have been different. Whether it would have been better, whether the insertion of Allied forces into the Balkans in 1944 would have prevented Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, or simply produced a different set of conflicts with the Soviet Union at the moment of its maximum military power, is a question that the record cannot definitively answer. What is clear is this: Eisenhower was right about the transportation plan, because D-Day succeeded. He was right about Anvil, because the campaign in France succeeded. And the counterfactual, the invasion of the Balkans and its effect on post-war Europe, remains the great unresolved argument of the entire European campaign. Churchill sat in London on the 6th of June, 1944, and received the reports as they came in. The landings had gone in. Utah Beach had gone well. Omaha had been catastrophic in the first hours, and then, through what the survivors described as sheer human stubbornness, had been made to work. The paratroops had scattered but found each other. The beachhead existed. He had believed, in the deepest part of the memory that carried Gallipoli everywhere, that this day might produce the second great amphibious disaster of the wars he had lived through. He had opposed the operation for years through every means available to him, and then he had publicly supported it and privately doubted it. And finally, in the exchange of letters with King George VI in the first days of June, been prevented from being present when it either succeeded or failed. It succeeded. He is said to have wept when the first reports confirmed that the beachhead was established. If it had failed, the history of what caused the failure would have included, somewhere in its accounting, the record of every argument Churchill had made and every delay he had produced, and every alternative he had proposed. He knew this. He had known it for months. He was not the supreme commander, and he was not an obstructionist. He was a man who had been to one Gallipoli and was trying, with every political and rhetorical instrument available to him, to prevent another one. Eisenhower held the line every time. He held it over the transportation plan, over the ship, over Anvil. He held it with patience and firmness and an absolute refusal to be moved by the greatest political orator of the 20th century on questions where he had concluded that the military facts were clear and not subject to rhetorical revision. The invasion of Normandy launched on the 6th of June, 1944. It succeeded. 156,000 men crossed the English Channel and established the beachhead that would become the front, that would become the Allied advance into Germany, that would end the war in Europe 11 months later. The resignation letter stayed in the drawer. Eisenhower never sent it. That is the story. That is the record. Before you go, tell us in the comments what story we should cover next. The confrontations around D-Day produced some of the most extraordinary decisions in the history of the war. Tell us which figure, which decision, which moment you think deserves the full treatment. We read every comment, and your suggestions shape what this channel makes next. Subscribe and turn on the bell so you do not miss next week. These videos take extensive research to get right, and every like and subscription genuinely helps us keep making them. And if this story gave you something, the video on screen right now goes even deeper into the decisions that shaped the Allied command in the months before D-Day. Watch that next. This is World War II Demand. The decisions that shaped the world, given the weight they earned.